So this presentation is entitled Decision Making Theory, and it's the first of a small number of presentations that talk about the notion of decision making and how that plays out in a workplace context. And as with all of these lectures, what I really want you to think about is what it means for design. So how we can take an understanding of the way in which people make decisions into account when we are designing objects and systems and technologies. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is just what we mean by decision making and how that plays out in a practical setting. So what is decision making? Well, we can define decision making as being a situation where a person is required to make a choice from a number of choices, and that there's some amount of information available with respect to the choices. Now, there's a critical difference between decision making and some of the other concepts that we might have talked about, perhaps when we were talking about working memory or attention or things like this, which is that the time frame is relatively long. So it's very unusual that from a decision-making point of view, we're applying skill-based behaviour. We're usually talking about rule or knowledge-based behaviour, and there's some sort of level of uncertainty which is taken into account when we're considering what we mean by decision-making. So decision-making can be simply defined as a high-level cognitive process that makes use of more basic processes such as perception, working memory and attention. And it's linked to other high-level factors, more applied factors, which we've already talked about, like situation awareness or workload. Now, when we're thinking about decision-making, it's really helpful to think about the stages that we work through. And these are not so different from some of the stages we thought about when we were talking about human error. But in this context, we can break the stages of decision making down into obtaining and receiving cues, a bit like with situation awareness, where we talked about the sort of perception, recognition, and prediction. Well, here we talk about obtaining and receiving cues, so that's almost a combination of that perception and recognition element. Hypothesis generation and selection, so there being a process of going through these different alternatives that we mentioned before, and then selecting an action. Now, of course, after we've made a decision, we're going to execute an action. And remember that sort of bubble of attention that we tend to have at the top here, that is required to be maintained throughout the process, and also when it comes to action execution as well. So Wickens talks about an information processing approach to decision making, and I'll talk about a number of different types of approaches to decision making in this presentation and some of the later ones as well. So he argues that there's a necessary consideration of the cognitive components that are critical to decision making. These include selective attention. So remember, selective attention is about where we are selecting information from the range of different information that can be presented to us, and we use that to make a decision of some sort. Activities which are performed within the working memory. Remember, working memory is both that sort of quite short-term memory, quite short turnaround, but also includes some elements of information processing. And then information being retrieved from long-term memory. Any of you who've done a psychology degree will know there's an awful lot of literature out there about the way in which long-term memory works. We've only really covered a couple of elements around declarative and procedural memory, and then some specific issues around particularly eyewitness testimony and flashbulb memory. But it's worth knowing there's much more out there in terms of long-term memory as well. And what Wickens focuses on is that element of working memory where we are going through cue reception and integration, as I said before, hypothesis generation, evaluation and selection, and then generating and selecting actions. Now, Herb Simons, one of a really interesting group of people who worked in artificial intelligence and psychology in the 1970s, 80s and 90s, and he highlights the importance of bounded rationality. So talks about the fact that when we are making decisions, the rationality of individuals is limited by, first of all, the information they have. And remember that Donald Norman reminds us about the distinction between knowledge in the head and knowledge in the world. So information they have doesn't just talk about, say, the information that's in front of them. So as an ergonomist, we might not be able to always see all the information a person has because some of the information is in their head. But our cognitive processing, our minds, have cognitive limitations. And those cognitive limitations, such as, for example, the capacity limitation of working memory or some of the issues we've already described around attention, will then affect the ability for us to be rational in the way in which we're thinking. And then it's also limited by the finite amount of time we have to make a decision. And the time we have to make a decision can vary from everything from weeks to seconds. So that's a hugely impactful variable on our ability to collate and collect and think through information, and that is played out in terms of the rationality of individuals. It's worth saying, of course, I'm recording this in the time of COVID, and there's a really interesting discussion for us to have that I hope we'll sort of touch on in the class, which is actually around how we're seeing some of the real challenges to bounded rationality based on a combination of the sort of stress we're experiencing as the result of living through a global pandemic, so the cognitive limitations that's playing out in, the information we have, some of the biases in that information, the way in which that information is presented, our perceptions of expertise, and then of course time to make a decision. And some of the decisions we're making are, is it risky for me to step onto this tram? Is it risky for me to go into this shop, for example? Judging the behaviour of people around us, as well as some of the more planned actions we're seeing about, do I go on this journey or not? Now, it's worth also reminding ourselves that all of this takes place in that wider work context. So hopefully you remember this diagram from the very first lecture, where we talked about the setting of ergonomics and human factors. And just remember that this is where there's a really important element that plays out in terms of those things we can measure, our tasks, but the things that motivate us and influence us, our goals. Another thing that's really important in terms of this bounded rationality, the limitations on our ability to make decisions, are these external factors down here. These financial constraints and priorities, technical developments and capabilities, the legal and regulatory framework we work within, and the social influences, expectations and norms. Now, one of the areas closest to human factors and ergonomics that actually was awarded a Nobel Prize, I think it was in the early 2000s, is work that was proposed by Daniel Kahneman and Tversky, his collaborator. And Kahneman and Tversky, or Kahneman and Tversky, talk about a theory called prospect theory. What they argue is that decision making is influenced by our perceptions around gains and losses. And those perceptions can be influenced by the way in which we frame a message. So, for example, let's talk about a disease that may kill 600 people. Do you definitely save 200 people, or do you take a 1/3 chance to save everyone, but a 2/3 chance to save no one? And even though actually these are almost mathematically the same types of scenarios, what Kahneman and Tversky found was that people are much more likely to engage in risky behaviour that is associated with potential gains than they are with potential losses. So there's another way of phrasing it, which is definitely kill 400 people. And we see this come through in various sort of philosophy type problems. You may have come across the trolley problem, things like this. And it all is sort of underpinned by our likelihood of engaging in risky behaviour that is associated with potential gains. We see this in gambling literature and things like this as well. So an example might be, Do we buy the burgers that contain 10% fat or the burgers that contain 90% fat-free? I'd go for the 90% fat-free burgers. That's brilliant. That's 90% of those burgers have got no nasty fat in them at all. 10% fat, that sounds a lot. I don't want to go for that. Of course, it's exactly the same thing. So this model takes a slightly different perspective to the Kahneman-Tversky theory, in that it talks about recognition-primed decision making. And the point of recognition-primed decision making is it focuses on the role of previous experience and knowledge on decisions being made. So it's a diagram that sort of goes around in circles a little bit, but it's worth just sort of starting, I think, at the top here. So the first thing that happens is you experience the situation in a changing context. So let's think about a situation like a clinician who is in the middle of an operation and she experiences something which is slightly unexpected in terms of the way the operation is progressing. So the first thing she asks is the situation familiar? And if it is, then there are four aspects that have sort of fed into that recognition. First of all, the cues, the information that's being presented, but also the goals of the particular activity as well. So is the similar situation or the similar scenario that has she seen before, did it have similar cues, but also were those cues seen in a setting where there's similar goals as well? Then there are also recognition for the actions that are available and whether there's previous experience or knowledge about different actions that might work in a situation. And then the expectancies of the situation and the matching between both the setting of the goals and the actions that are being considered as well. If the situation is not familiar, then you might seek more information. You might speak to colleagues in the operating setting about, for example, the anaesthetist, about the different readings that are being made. You might even conduct slightly more investigation of the patient's state to understand what's happening. So there's a continual feedback loop that's happening here that helps you decide whether the situation is familiar or not. In terms of the recognition and those four elements, in terms of expectancies, we then consider whether the expectancies are violated or not. If they are violated, then you might seek more information and go around this loop again. So there's a continual loop here in terms of the impact of the actions on the situation and continually whether the expected consequences of those actions has the result that you might normally have. So let's say you might ask the anaesthetist to administer more of a drug. You would normally expect that that would have an impact on the blood pressure of the patient, and actually the pattern doesn't particularly follow your expected pattern of results. As well as actions, one of the things that you would do first of all is mentally stimulate what the impact of the action might be. And at this point, you're then thinking, well, will it work? And yes, then you implement the action. No, then you come back and you try more and more actions. So you're sort of feeding through this way. And then in terms of the modification, it's thinking about, will it work? Yes, but I'm a bit worried about this potential aspect of the action or another, and so you might modify your action appropriately. So the thing here that's quite different is there's much less emphasis on things like the message framing or anything like this, and much more emphasis on the role of past experience in decision making. So those two quite theoretical models, but it's worth thinking about what actually happens when we make decisions in a real world context. Well, the first thing is that both between individuals and within an individual, we have variable perception of risk. So I might perceive an action as more risky than my friend. I can give you an example. So very sadly, a few years ago, a friend of mine was killed crossing a road. And there was a speeding motorcyclist that killed her pretty much outright. As a result, I have a very, very high perception of risk when it comes to crossing a road. And my friends notice it actually, because I will always hesitate when I'm crossing. She was at a pedestrian crossing. and I will always hesitate, and it's only if I'm absolutely sure that I will cross if there isn't a sort of a green signal saying it's okay for me to cross. And obviously routinely, it's a good example of a routine violation. We very often cross a road when the red person is showing, but we can actually see that the road is clear. Sadly, that's exactly what my friend did. But there was the speeding motorcyclist came so quickly she couldn't see them. So in this particular example, I have an unusually high perception of risk in a particular situation that I experience very regularly. However, my own perception of risk also varies in different types of settings. So if I'm driving my car, I might consider whether it is risky to also hold a conversation with a friend in the car or a member of my family whilst I am driving. And if I perceive that the driving situation I'm in is quite risky at the time, I will probably sort of not have the conversation, but if I feel it's quite comfortable and quite safe, I will do that. Similarly, I probably commit routine violations in terms of occasionally going slightly over the speed limit. And it's one of those violations we all commit quite often. And in that sort of situation, I probably will make a judgment. So if it's raining, I will absolutely not speed, and I will probably go well under the speed limit if it's raining and there's dangerous sort of splashing on the road. But if it's sort of bright and dry and there's very clear visibility, I'd be much more likely to commit that routine violation. The personal relations we have to the outcomes also affect the nature of our decision making. If I'm making a decision about, I don't know, where to plant one of the plants in my garden, then I might just think, do you know what, this is a cheap plant, I took it as a cutting from something else, I'm going to see if it's going to work in this particular part of the garden, and if it doesn't, I've lost nothing. So no one's been put at danger, I've not lost much from a financial point of view. Actually, it's quite interesting, you get to learn about which plants grow in which parts of the garden. But if I'm considering whether it's okay to take the chicken out of the oven a little bit early because I'm in a bit of a rush, but I know there's a really big risk of food poisoning, and giving food poisoning to my family members as well as myself, if I do take the chicken out of the oven too early, I will be much less likely to take that risk. So that's about my personal, the impact of that particular risk on me personally and on my family. We also have a natural aversion to negative emotions. So there's a greater perceived risk when we've got a personal attachment to a situation, or we're personally involved with a situation, but also the anticipated regret or how awful you'd feel if you gave your family food poisoning. We also tend to have an aversion to action as opposed to inaction. We're much more tempted to just see how things go, just see if we stick with this particular activity, or we just see if the situation fixes itself. It's the sort of thing, I've got a mobile phone that just keeps going wrong and I really ought to do something about it. But I've convinced myself it's sorted itself out. I've convinced myself that it does a really weird thing where the screen suddenly goes blank. And I've just convinced myself it'll all be all right. Because I've got an aversion to action. The action I should be taking is arranging for it to be swapped at the shop, and because it's still in guarantee and all that sort of thing. We're also subject to social norms and pressures. So even I, when I'm sort of going out for walks with friends that I do quite often now, feel under a little bit of social pressure to cross the road when my friend feels it comfortable, but I'm a bit more nervous. And actually, you know, me being me, we usually have a bit of a conversation about it, I explain and it's fine. But we often see, and particularly amongst sort of situations where peer pressure is really strong, people sort of succumbing to peer pressure or succumbing to fitting within the social norm. Really good example of this is where we're walking along a busy pavement, for example, and there's maybe an obstruction, and in order to get around the obstruction, you have to go outside of a barrier and maybe walk along the road for a little bit. And it's a really strange thing to do, because what you'll probably do is follow the people in front of you. So it is a risk, and you might even know it's risky, but because everyone else is doing it, because it might be inconvenient to other people for you to go around another way or something like that, you'll follow that particular path. We're also often dealing with very complex multifactorial situations, and we have therefore an aversion to loss, an aversion to damage of items, to financial loss, to physical harm, and a risk aversion as well. And we may vary in terms of that risk aversion. That sort of, it's a bit like, I'm quite risk averse, so I'm not a big fan of, climbing up on, I don't know, large sort of outward bound obstacles, and the sort of the risk of falling, even with a safety harness and things like this, is something I feel quite strongly. And we often inappropriately connect prior events. So I might have gone on, I don't know, one really poor quality outward bound course and suffered a bit of an injury, or was worried because the harness didn't work properly. And so even though there's absolutely no reason why that should apply in a new situation, that might affect my decision making. A really interesting effect that I'll talk about on the next slide as well is called sunk cost effect. This is where, when we've invested financially or from a time point of view in a particular solution, even if that solution is not working, we have a tendency to stick with the original solution. And then also omission bias, so a bias towards inaction. So these give an example of something called sunk cost bias. So it's a really nice example at the top here. Imagine you've spent, this is a South African example actually, 5,000 Rand for a weekend hiking trip to the Drakensberg. Several weeks later, you spend 2,500 for a weekend hiking trip to the Waterberg. You think you will enjoy the Waterberg trip more than the Drakensberg trip. But then you realise you've booked both trips for the same weekend, and you can't get a refund for either. You must go on one trip and not the other. Which trip do you go on? One would expect everyone to choose the trip which is expected to be more enjoyable, the Waterberg trip. But a surprisingly large number of people choose the Drakensberg trip in experiments like this because of the larger sunk cost, which is influencing the choice. And of course, we see this in all sorts of marketing type scenarios as well. A slight analogy I always talked about here. I struggle with my weight a lot. I have to sort of avoid eating unhealthy food, and I'm not very good at avoiding eating unhealthy food because I put on weight. And before the pandemic, I would very often travel for work, and I'd have to stay over at a hotel, and my breakfast would be included. And even though when I'm at home, I just have a bowl of cereal and a glass of juice for breakfast, and that's it. If I'm in a hotel, I sort of think, well, someone's paid for my breakfast, so I must have all of this food that is presented in front of me. I don't particularly want it. I worry about putting on weight as a result of it, but because of this sunk cost fallacy, which is even more illogical because most of the time it's not my personal money that's paying for it, but another sort of resource such as a company or a project or the university or something like that. And I suppose I feel responsible for that money that's being spent as if it was my own money. It's worth reading about the Brandenburg Berlin airport. This is an airport, it's actually, I believe it's opening like in the last couple of weeks or something. But it has been an absolute disaster in terms of the length of time it has taken to be completed. And it probably was just a really bad idea in terms of some of the technology that was implemented and the approach that was taken. But the authorities stuck with it, and hopefully it will pay off now. But I think it was originally due to open I'm just trying to think, because I actually went to Berlin and I was told it was due to open. And I think it might have been before my children were born, and my daughter's 16. So a really, really long time it's been. No, I tell a lie. Sorry, my son was 2. So it was 11 years ago. I've exaggerated. So I think that there's a real, sort of 2 or 3. So there was a real challenge in terms of that sort of airport and getting it up to speed. Another example of sunk cost bias, the Concorde fallacy. Concorde, I don't know if you know, was a supersonic aircraft that was ran in sort of 1970s and 80s and finally sort of finished in the 90s, 2000s. It was never a profit-making activity, but And so it was a joint activity between Britain and France. The government and various industries invested millions and millions of pounds in this hugely impressive, very beautiful aircraft. But there was very little prospect of a commercial return. But because so much money had been sunk into the notion of Concorde, then it actually coined the phrase the Concorde fallacy to describe the misguided spending of more money on a project in order not to waste the money previously spent on it. Other things that we ought to think about are the context that people find themselves in. People make bad choices if they're mad or scared or stressed or hungry or tired. If you're ever on parole in the US, try and make sure that you get heard really early in the day or immediately after a meal break, because you'll see on this diagram here that what we have is number of cases heard in a day and the favourable rulings by parole boards. So if you were the first case heard or second case heard in the day, you're about sort of 60 or 70% likely to have a favourable ruling. But goodness me, if you're just before a meal break or the parole board are tired or hungry, you're around about sort of 20 to 10% chance. So there's an astonishing impact of the factors associated with decision making just around sort of being tired and hungry. Now, the two final theories I want to talk about. The first one is called elaboration likelihood theory. And this proposes that individual decision making occurs through two potential routes, which are called peripheral processing and central processing. And central processing is described as occurring in instances of what's called high involvement. And this proposes that individuals make decisions when it's possible or desirable for them to be focused and be engaged. So high involvement processing involves, first of all, being motivated and being able to think about the message and its topic. When you're processing information centrally, it's felt that messages are more likely to persist and responses would be more relevant to the topic, and that you will assess the relevant information in relation to the patterns of information that they already possess. So this central processing is quite focused decision making, and it involves that combination of motivation and the actual way in which information is used. When decision makers, however, are not in a high involvement state, then that peripheral processing route will be taken. And one of the things that we know, and we're seeing a lot of persuasive communication around, wear a face covering, follow this one-way system, is in the individual being in a low involvement state. So there is a risk that if you're in a low involvement state, you're not necessarily focused on the task, you've got different types of motivation. Then the elaboration likelihood model, ELM, proposes that the decision making will be influenced by much more surface level characteristics. And examples of these surface level characteristics are, this feels about right, this matches previous patterns I've observed. So we sort of almost jump very quickly without this conscious detailed processing to a default pattern of behaviour. And empirical studies that have collected data have demonstrated that when recipients are unable to focus or are unmotivated, then the message quality, the persuasiveness and the content does little to exert the influence on the attitude they form towards the communication. So it really shows that the focus should be around the motivation and the ability and investment in gaining information, rather than necessarily focusing on the message content, the quality and the persuasiveness. In a low involvement state, people are significantly influenced by judgment indicators like the credibility of the source or the length of the communication. This is something we're seeing very interestingly in some of the press conferences. So I'm a big fan of one of the Deputy Chief Medical Advisors, Jonathan Van Tam, who is a colleague here at Nottingham. And if you've seen some of Jonathan Van Tam's presentations in some of the UK government press conferences, he is he comes across as very credible. He's very thoughtful, very slow and deliberate in his speech. but he also doesn't shy away from detail. He takes time to make an explanation. He used some lovely analogies earlier this week that really both made sense and lightened the very difficult communication he was having. In addition, the influence of source effects often influence perception significantly when participants are in what we call a low involvement state. So the influence of those source effects, the credibility of the source, for example, or the influence of the communication, can actually influence the extent to which you're perceiving. It genuinely is that attentional property of just paying attention because someone's voice is really engaging, or the explanation is taking a longer time and your attention is therefore held really effectively. An analogous but slightly different take on these different types of processing is what's called the dual process theory of thought. And I'm going to go through this and then I'm going to show you quite a nice diagram that shows the relationship between the elaboration likelihood model and dual process theory. Dual process theory is a bit of an umbrella concept that talks about something through which something we talk about as nudge theory is currently understood. Dual process theory proposes that two coexisting systems of processing are responsible for decision making, and they're talked about system 1 processing and system 2 processing, or type 1 processing and type 2 processing. The argument is that type 1 processing is autonomous and does not engage working memory. So it's the skill-based behaviour, the type of automatic behaviour that we also saw in the elaboration likelihood model. But type 2 processing is defined as the requirement on working memory and features of mental stimulation and cognitive decoupling. So one of the things we might do as ergonomists is think about how can we encourage or require type 2 processing. One of the things we're getting quite a lot of feedback on in terms of encouraging and requiring people to comply with COVID policies, such as wearing of face coverings if you're able, and adhering with social distancing, is that actually we're needing to continually refresh these messages and encourage people to move to type 2 processing. So thinking about things like increasing people's understanding of why it's so important to wear face coverings properly over the face and over the mouth and the nose, for example, why it's continually important to maintain social distancing even if maybe you've had COVID, and these sorts of things. So we're having to continually update the way in which we're explaining things from a societal point of view at the moment. Now, either of these processing systems can give rise to a given decision or behavioural outcome, and it's argued that the two systems operate interactively. So it's not necessarily that you're just using type 1 or system 1 processing and just using type 2. You can move between the two really quickly. So these nudges of type 1 and type 2 are classified according to the degree to which processing efforts are needed to maintain psychological coherence. Examples of type 2 nudges include social normative messaging, moral persuasion, and information mechanisms such as introducing new data, communicating risks, benefits, or the use of warnings or reminders. And we are seeing this play out right now as we're going through the COVID-19 pandemic. And they argue, the authors Lynn Osman and Ashcroft, that type 2 nudges should be the preferred nudge intervention of use. And so consciousness of system 1 processing, or type 1, that automatic processing, only extends to just an awareness of the thinking output rather than the process of thinking itself. So type 2 nudges aim to make decision makers at a minimum more conscious of their cognitive process by which they've come to their decision. It's about reminders. So even the presence of a security guard going, oh, could you just remember to put your face covering on, could be enough just to remind people and encourage them to be more thoughtful about the choice they're making. So this final slide just focuses on the differences and similarities between the different theories. So you can see that there's a strong similarity between what we talked about as low involvement in elaboration likelihood model and type 1 processing or peripheral processing in dual process theory. And And then high involvement is much more analogous to type 2 or system 2 processing. Type 1 processing is the sort of the processes which govern decision making, which, subject to sufficient resources, might or might not be sequentially overridden by type 2 processing. So type 1 processing may well be overridden by type 2 processing. So we might see automatic behaviours that we need to stop through some sort of design intervention. And so often that's when we might build in design constraints, for example, to stop people engaging in an automatic behaviour in some way, or a very habitual behaviour of some sort. So I'll just conclude by thinking about the implications of all of this for design. The first is just to remember this presence of sort of bias and subject to all these external effects in human decision making. And then we can think about how to consider all of these different types of theories when it comes to product and system design. Okay.